MotoGP teams are always trying to get the best from their equipment, and most of the materials used by the manufacturers are made in-house. There are a few, however, that are outsourced. Take KTM. They use WP suspension, and that's exactly who we're going to see for this week's Piece of the Week. I'm Amy Reynolds, and we're taking a closer look at the rear shock with WP suspension. This is Peter, he's the racing manager for WP Suspension, and today, Peter, you're going to be showing me the rear shock, and I think we should start right at the basics and just explain the role and the job of the rear shock.
Basically, the rear shock has a few functions. First of all, it has to sustain the rider and the bike, of course, so it has to sustain the weight of the bike and the rider to keep the attitude of the bike, and then also cope with all the irregularities of the road.
And in terms of the materials you used to build it, are you allowed to tell us through and point it? We've got a rear shock right here, so we might as well.
Yeah, of course. This is the rear shock for MotoGP, so it has a mainspring that obviously keeps the weight of the bike and the rider in the right place. And inside we have a damping system that actually allows the suspension to decide how fast it compresses or extends. So that we can adjust on these two adjusters.
And in terms of the technology, has it progressed much over the years?
Of course, refinement of material and technology inside, yes. But as we cannot have electronic suspension, we are quite at a high level, and it's difficult these days to improve these products, to be honest.
One thing we always like to talk about on Piece of the Week is how much the technology we use here in MotoGP differs from that of your average road bike user. So in terms of a rear shock on our MotoGP bike, Moto2 and Moto3 compared to our road bike, is there much difference?
Yes, of course, all the tolerances are really tight, and also the weight of the product is really important, so for sure this has an impact on cost of the product, so it will differ from a road bike, let's say. But basically we try to always downscale whatever we learn here to an aftermarket product and eventually production. And
one thing we do in the World Championship is obviously tailor things to rider preference. Is there much tailoring when it comes to the rear shock? I'm guessing it's one thing that gets changed quite a lot throughout the weekend.
Yeah, of course. It's a lot rider preference, but for the rear shock, I would say it's a lot also from the data collection to see. We always try to optimize the handling of the bike and the grip level. This is basically the main thing. Also to remember that the rear shock is attached to the bike, and the bike has a linkage system, so we have so many options to choose from when we set up the bike. So maybe rider preference, but I would say overall it's more the technicians and the team that sort of set up the suspension to the optimized.
So give us an example. So we have come from Aragon to here in Valencia. How would the rear shock change from those two circuits?
Well, I would say the basic setup would be spring and preload to get the right height and the attitude of the bike, and then you would start to look at the grip level of the track at a certain condition, and then you will start to work from there. But we're talking quite small changes, to be honest.
So we are in the truck, which is the workshop. So I'm guessing this is where a lot of the servicing and maintenance of all of the suspension goes on. Typically, what are the main things that need to be kind of kept an eye on over the course of the weekend in case there's a crash or anything like that?
Well, of course, if we have a crash, we have a crash check, and then we disassemble the whole shock and check everything we can check, of course. For maintenance, we have a set mileage that we take the shock apart and service and change service parts and so on, but that normally is done before the race weekend starts on the Thursday.
It looks quite complicated to take that thing apart.
It's not so complicated as it looks. No, to be honest, it's not so bad.
Do you have like a special machine to do it, or is it all done by hand?
It's all done by hand, and then we have, of course, a vacuum machine to bleed because it's obviously got oil in it.
Yeah.
That we bleed the shock with, so we have no air in it. And then we have a dynamometer that we can check all the damping forces after we serviced it. So,
Peter, you mentioned that each rear shock has a certain mileage. So typically, how many rear shocks get used over, I don't know, a season? Or is it easier to say a race, a race
yeah,
weekend?
normally each rider has 6 rear shocks, so
Okay.
we will keep always 2 for the wet. And then we have 2 shocks for each bike that we can use for example, if we need to change a spring, we have the shock all ready to go with the new spring on it. So normally I would say 6 shocks per riders. Then in the course of the year we have updates or maybe new shocks, and then of course there's a new 6 shocks. So there's a lot of suspension floating around for sure.
So here in Valencia, I think we're going to have another wet race weekend by the looks of things. So when you talk about how things can change between dry settings, wet settings, how does that change when it comes to the shock?
Well, basically in a wet condition you don't have the same grip level obviously, so you will not have the suspension go as deep as you would in a dry condition. So I would say on an average we would drop the spring rate, so make the spring softer about 10, 12, 15%, something like this, and open up a little bit the damping, because of course the shock absorber will work in a cooler environment, and then you have to open up the damping a bit to get the same force. It's not any big changes, but for sure we have to adjust.
So there you have it. Hopefully now you know more about the complex world of rear shocks. Big thanks to WP Suspension and Peter, and we'll see you next time.